Okay, it's really good to be here. It's so exciting to be with a bunch of people, as Richard said, who really care. My background is in health as well. I worked in sexual health and bloodborne viruses, and also in health promotion in the north coast of New South Wales, and in tobacco control, and also in, as I will explain, working with regional organisations to address climate change. And then things took an interesting detour for me when the region I live in, which is just below the Queensland border, I became aware that every square inch of it nearly, was covered in licences for unconventional gas fields, particularly coal seam gas and tight gas. So I'm going to talk about networked power and healthy communities. And I'm really, as I was thinking about today, I was looking at my Twitter feed and looking what's going on in the Caribbean and this massive tropical cyclone that's just barreled past Cuba at a level 5 hurricane and is heading and has done untold destruction to island communities in the Caribbean and is heading towards Florida, which we know is a region that's very, very threatened by climate change and rising seas. So when at times like this, the unbelievable injustice of the dilemma we face with global warming really strikes us. And what I want to share with you is something that I have really learnt through recent years, which is that communities that fight the injustice and build very complex networks of resistance are also the communities that will handle what happens best. They will be the communities that have the resilience to handle disasters when they strike. So I'm going to tell you a story about that. So working in health promotion, I always liked the Ottawa Charter. And it says that the fundamental conditions for health are peace, shelter, education, food, income, a stable ecosystem, sustainable resources, social justice, and equity. And with its focus on strengthening community action, it invited us to engage communities in problem solving. There's so much evidence that when we connect people up, they can co-create solutions to food, to safety, to social cohesion with multiple co-benefits for health. Community development projects work in so many ways, but they don't sit nicely with top-down linear project design. The sort of project logic that goes A, B, C, D, and then you get E outcome. And when you go for grants, that's how they often want you to package it up. No, community development projects involve pesky human interaction, They have multiple agents coming together in complex systems that we don't control. And to liberate the creative potential in communities, we join with others to be stewards of generative networks focused on problem solving, because that's where the juice is. The title of this address is Networked Power and Healthy Communities. And I'd like to share some of my experience of generative networks and what I mean by them. Working in New South Wales North Coast Health Promotion, I was part of a stewardship team for Sustain Northern Rivers, a collaboration of peak regional organisations to address climate change. And our governance model was informed by complexity concepts to enable emergent solutions. Starting in 2009, we had action areas for food, for energy, for transport, and social innovation. And we fostered the emergence of a problem-solving network that delivered more and more and more over time and eventually contributed to the emergence of some groundbreaking community projects. My fabulous colleague, Eric van Beurden, insisted we evaluate and publish. And bear in mind that we were aiming for the holy grail of distributed leadership. So Eric initiated a social network analysis, and we were able to show rapid growth of our network, which is not difficult to do. So this is our network. The little squares are the participating organisations, so that's before we started, and this is after we started. So, you know, using social network analysis, you can do this kind of thing. And that was just after 2 years. It grew way bigger after that. But what was really interesting to us was that the network increased in density, reciprocity and clustering, and it decreased in centralisation. Just what we wanted to see, because distributed leadership won't emerge from top-down networks. The reason I'm sharing this is because my involvement in Sustain Northern Rivers and my deepening understanding of network qualities was really important learning for me before I got an amazing experience with communities using their network power to take charge of their destiny. So Sustain Northern Rivers had quite limited capacity to really reach into communities. And this deficit for a few of us was about to be remedied. And this was the cure for me. Ironically, this is a map of the Northern Rivers. And that wriggly bit up the top is the border with Queensland. And, you know, we've got the towns of Kyogle, Lismore, Casino, Grafton, Ballina and Byron, which many of you will recognise. So basically, we became aware that our entire region was covered in exploration licences for coal seam gas, tight gas, and later we became aware that there was a shale resource underneath all of that. In 2011, we didn't have the body of peer-reviewed evidence that shows risks to air, to health, to water from shale, tight gas and coal seam gas fields. That is there now. There are now 685 peer-reviewed articles that show risks on all of these fronts. But what we did have, oh, I keep skipping that one, was images like this of a tight gas field in Wyoming. And we did know that it was this kind of spatial intensity that amplified all of the risks, whether or not it was fracked. So in late 2011, I decided to throw myself into the campaign to liberate our region from that threat. The experience was really, really amazing. It was the best experience I've had of working with people. The government was hell-bent on imposing this invasive industry on our communities, even when it became apparent that the vast, you know, the huge majority of the population was vehemently opposed to that. So I was part of a capacity building team that set about scaling up the social movement. And with many thousands of passionate people involved, it was a wild, wild ride. And we actually achieved mass movement dynamics in the region, which when I ask historians, when has that happened in Australian history, they say, really, in a region, a whole region arcing up? Eureka Stockade. So something really amazing happened in the Northern Rivers. This image shows 7,000 people in Lismore, where we defiantly and unilaterally declared our region gas field free. The campaign deployed a range of strategies, and eventually, with their backs to the wall, communities decided to come to each other's aid by engaging in non-violent civil resistance. Things came to a head at the famous Bentley blockade, which some of you may have heard of. And this is where the community resistance grew to such a scale that the New South Wales government, with all of its resources, could not break that blockade, which went for 5 months. For 5 months, people sustained that to stop a drill rig from going in. And eventually, the government, realising that they could not break through that level of community resistance, they suspended the drilling licence. And in late 2015, we achieved victory when the New South Wales government bought back the last of the 14 gas licences that covered the region. If you want to get a feeling for this, check out the film called The Bentley Effect, which is a really fantastic feature-length documentary that is very, very inspiring. I think it's worth pausing to consider this from the perspective of resilience theory for a moment. So Brian Walker and Salt, his colleague who wrote a book called Resilience Thinking, defined resilience as the ability of a system to absorb disturbance and still retain its basic function and structure. And resilience theory goes on to describe social ecological systems as complex integrated systems in which humans are part of nature. And they would go on to say, and that the humans have a stewardship role of the system. Looking from this perspective, I think one could say that the Northern Rivers communities were resisting a threat that was being imposed on them that would have altered their access to clean air, water, and impacted their industries and communities, and threatened their health and well-being. They were stepping into a powerful active stewardship role for their social ecological system. They were doing that bit of the Ottawa Charter that's called strengthening communities. They were doing that big time. So the eventual victory of Gas Will Free Northern Rivers campaign was achieved via a very complex system of distributed leadership, and this was its architecture. So what you can see here is the alliance. There were about 18 action groups, which were mostly location-based. There were a couple of people who shared a coordination role. There were 147 gas-field-free communities. So this is very complex. You can see this system of distributed leadership is complex indeed. And we couldn't have won without that. And in fact, had we had a top-down kind of, top-down system, it just wouldn't have worked. So the concept of the gas-field-free community started in a little village where I live called the Channon, and it went viral immediately. And it's a thorough grassroots process of grassroots democracy, whereby community members visit, well, they have a meeting, and then they decide to do the process, and then they form teams and visit every house in their district with a survey question, which is, do you want your lands and roads gas-field free? And when they gather in this survey with a majority, they unilaterally declare themselves gas-field free, despite the fact that they have, by law, no power to do this, and in fact no power to say no to the gas companies in law. So this is an image of Lismore early in this year when Cyclone Debbie hit the Queensland coast. It came down and the conditions caused catastrophic flooding. There was an unbelievable amount of rain, and this was a major, major disaster in Lismore. Within 24 hours, about 6,000 people had responded to a Facebook request for volunteers to help with this heartbreaking cleanup. And the young woman who initiated it, immediately, she initiated this thing, and then she thought, help, what do I do now? So she went to Gas Will Free Northern Rivers, which of course has all these incredible networks and quite a bit of know-how. So this was the genesis of Lismore's Helping Hands volunteer response, and they persuaded the council to let them use the railway station, and then they organised volunteers in groups of 5. And it was an incredible thing, and is now being studied because it is a truly remarkable community-led volunteer response, self-organised. The remarkable network soft infrastructure that we'd built resisting a risky fossil fuel development was now being deployed to help our community deal with catastrophic flooding, the sort of flooding that we will see more of due to climate change. So I just want to go to power. That's a picture of the helping hands people, so power. That's a picture of the Acland coal mine in the Darling Downs of Queensland. This mine has destroyed the Acland township, devoured farms, and filled the lungs of people with coal dust. But New Hope Coal wanted more than this. They wanted an expansion. And so they set about getting this stage 3 expansion, and Campbell Newman was about to have a crack at winning the Queensland election, and he said, don't worry, stage 3 is not going to happen. You have no concerns. But what people didn't know was that, unbeknownst to them, close to $1 million was being funneled into the Liberal National Party coffers. So immediately after the election, Campbell Newman changed his mind and stage 3 was to go ahead. So this is power. This is a type of power. And it's the sort of power that Richard was talking about that corrupts our democracy. And not only do we have donations pouring into the major parties, but there's a revolving door between lobbyists and the government. So fossil fuel interests dictate policy. So social movements arise at moments in history when the gap between what we know to be right and just and what's happening is so extreme that the only option we have to restore justice is to generate a social movement. And the Lock the Gate movement is such a movement. It is a very unusual alliance of very conservative farming people who perhaps might be National Party or Liberal Party affiliated, with First Nations people of that country, and with environmentalists. So it's a network of networks. So it has individual members, it encourages the formation of self-organised groups, and for the same reason it encourages the formation of regional alliances. And the reason Lock the Gate does this is because we believe in the power of collective intelligence, and we encourage these formation of self-organised groups. And by encouraging decentralised groups like that, we've been able to generate a very powerful, very turbulent social movement. Just for your information, there are now 450 gas oil-free or coal-free communities around Australia. And the most recent of them is at Kingaroy, where a bunch of farmers have declared themselves coal-free because somebody wants to put a company wants to put a coal mine on that high-value farming land. In late 2012, when I was co-developing Gas Oil-Free Community Strategy, I jumped from health promotion into Lock the Gate. I've learnt so much in these years, how we can, a network of networks like that can leverage collective intelligence, the skills needed, and I've learnt about the skills needed to foster self-organised groups, and how we can convert community power to political power. And the thing that strikes me as most important is that the necessity, when facing injustice, of us to organise in face-to-face groups. It is only in face-to-face groups that this extraordinary thing called collective intelligence is liberated. There's research on it, there's a body of knowledge on it. It gets liberated in face-to-face groups. So earlier this year, I felt compelled, even though it's not really part of my job, to organise a little rally in front of our local member, because Scott Morrison, our treasurer, had said that perhaps he wants to withhold GST funds from states and territories that have moratoria on fracking gas fields. And so I organised a bit of a rally, and it was really good fun. It was really good fun to get back into a bit of that kind of pop-up action. And afterwards, instead of rushing home, I decided to go and have coffee with 3 of the women who were there. And they looked so content in each other's company that I asked if I could take their photo. Oops, we're skipping that. There they are. And, look at the love. These are people who have fought a battle together. And this is a picture of the collateral well-being that comes from being involved in social movements. It is a thing. I think it's really worth noting. I started with the Ottawa Charter so full of promise. I described the value of understanding network qualities, of decentralised networks. I shared the story of the Northern Rivers people, you know, how they protected their social ecological system through their mastery of non-violent conflict. And then, when hit by catastrophic flooding, how those same networks were the means whereby they came up with this extraordinary community-led disaster response. I went on to focus on power, who's got it, why we need to get it, why we need people power, and I showed you a picture of 3 women as representing the collateral well-being that comes from fighting together. So, back to the Ottawa Charter. I believe that we can better realise the wonderful potential of this framework if we integrate new ways of thinking about change. And reflecting on my learning from recent years, this is what I think we need. A critical analysis of power and why advocacy without grassroots power will fail us. A theoretical understanding of social movements matched by lived experience. Familiarity with resilience theory and understanding of the dynamics of adaptive and complex systems. The soft skills to empower self-organised grassroots groups and to work in distributed leadership. Oops, I meant to be pressing this button. Giving up control, taking up stewardship, and last but not least, courage. So, I think we're pretty close to the rounding off time. So I think what I'll finish with here is that you know, look, it's a strange thing, but I think if a huge fire, if we lived in a village and a massive fire was coming towards our village, I really don't think we would have a problem with an appropriate response. We would scramble to make sure everyone was safe. And so our challenge is that, you know, the threat of these global changes to our climate system, our life support system, are every bit as extreme and life-threatening as, you know, a huge fire coming to a village where we were living, say. So our challenge is to skip beyond the lure or the entrancement of the ordinary and to get together in, as Richard was saying, in face-to-face groups, because I worry, you know, with this massive stuff that's going on in you know, heading towards Florida, that if our connection with this stuff is through our Facebook and Twitter feed, and that's primarily our connection with it, I worry for us. I worry for our mental and well-being and emotional well-being. And so it's not just that when we get in face-to-face groups that we become effective and we liberate this incredible collective intelligence, but it's also very protective for us. So, you know, I'd like you to just keep that image in your mind of the collateral well-being of those 3 women, because I think that is something that we can, you know, that is the positive story from fighting together and liberating everything that we have, all our differences. And I'd just like to finish by saying I went to a little workshop which Harry and Kate were running. Where are you, Harry and Kate? It was great. And we went around the room and people shared all their skills or their you know, something that they had to contribute. And I thought, yeah, you put all those ingredients together, you know, we can do something. So that's where I'd like to finish.